I'd like to clarify a little bit more the idea of independence of thought. I remember that when I studied cooperative learning under the Johnsons, one of the courses that they give is called creative conflict, which is teaching students how to disagree. And the underlying message of creative conflict was you don't change your mind unless you're convinced. It's to allow people to really explore what they know and what they believe and what they've learned so that they can present it, they can share it, and they can conflict, but not change their minds without being convinced. And the the underlying message is that everyone has some place where they go to learn their truths, and everyone has to have some place where they go to discover that their truths are not correct. I think that the underlying push was to get away from people believing things just because it felt like it, just because their gut told them that this was true. And the the need to have something that is a source of truth comes together with the fact that there's, if that truth indicates otherwise, that means that there is the ability to find out that something is false. We have a tradition and a revelation which tells us information about the world, about what is right and wrong, about Hashem. We have a source of information. And that source of information is meant to inform us as to what is true. And it is also meant to provide a basis for discovering that something that we think is not true. And that's really what the learning process is about. And it's what the religious process is about. And it serves as the basis for independence. Meaning, if your opinion is not derived from air, from CNN, from billboards, from advertisements, then it is an opinion that is formed based on its allegiance with the sources of truth. It's also why that if somebody can show me that I have erred in my understanding of that source of truth, that I can modify my belief because I've been shown that something that I believe is not correct. And the way that it becomes not correct is because I now know more about the tradition. I know more about the source of truth than I knew before. I sometimes think that in the Western world, where they've lost all anchors, are really lost. I would suggest that instead of asking people, what are your pronouns? And that's become the politically correct thing to ask people is what are your pronouns? They should ask people, what is your source of truth? And what would establish that you are in error? And so much of debating and discussing or really just yelling at one another is all, it misses completely the sense that there is a source of truth and therefore a source of error. Because of the social pressure or the social contamination, if you will, of sources of truth, it is in the nature of someone who is who had allegiance to Hashem and his Torah to avoid excessive contact, certainly to avoid contact with advertisements, with editorials, with things that could potentially distort because they're not derived from the same source of truth. They're derived from somebody's perspective, which may or may not be informed by that same truth. So one of the features of a Talmid Chacham is that he doesn't get moved by those sources. He doesn't even get exposed to them. I remember one of the early conversations that I had with one of my Rebbeim, Rabbi Davidowitz, back in Rochester when I was a little boy, and going back 50 years. And he said that he was crossing the street with his brother, and he said that a certain car that looked very, very fancy. It looked very fancy. He was very impressed with the car. And his brother said to him, "It's not fancy, it's just new." And I remember being struck by the fact that most people, when they see a new car, think it's a fancy car. But a person who's been learning and analyzing Torah is able to immediately sense that it's not a fancy car, it's a new car, which looks fancy because it's new. It's a classic example of where people at large, they err in their judgments. And somebody who is grounded in source can see through those errors in judgment and can continue to have their allegiance to truth. Avraham Avinu was able to do this to the point where he earned the title of an Ivri. An Ivri is someone who stands on one side of the river while the entire world stands on the other side. Interestingly, when Moshe introduces Hashem to the Pharaoh, he says to Paro, Elokei ha'Ivriyim shalachani. The Hashem who is the Lord of the Ivriyim. It's not used anywhere else. That term is regularly referred to as Ivrim. But he referred to them as the Ivriyim because they had this unique characteristic, having been descended from Avraham Avinu. They had almost a genetic capacity to stand on one side of the river when the entire world stands on the other side. And standing together with truth means the allegiance and the alignment with the source of truth, which is the Torah, which is Hashem. And that creates what appears to be a stubbornness, an inflexibility that others interpret as being an inability to see another viewpoint. And a person needs to be very careful. It's not an inability to see another viewpoint. It's a clarity of allegiance, of knowing that there is truth in the world and there is otherwise. There is a spirit in the air, zeitgeist. There's a spirit of democratic thinking, which means that everyone's entitled to an opinion, and every opinion has validity. I would say that every opinion that feels valid has some place in truth. Isn't that fascinating? Every opinion that resonates for people has a basis in truth. So, for example, Freud said that the sexual drive is the primal drive of the human being. How do we know that he was right? Since it resonates for many people, and we know that it's right because there are many halachos that govern that drive. That's how we know that he was right. And how do we know that he's wrong? We know that he's wrong because it's not the whole Torah. Marx thought that the economic drive is at the core of human behavior, and that needs to be squelched in order to achieve the desired state for human beings. How do we know that he's right? It resonates for many people, and we know that it's correct because the halachos abound as to how we are meant to relate to the economic drive. How do we know that he's wrong? We know that he's wrong because it's not the only halachos in the Torah, and it fits into a context of the Torah, but is by no means the whole story. And that's how we know that that which resonates for people has some place in truth. The problem is that people grab on to the part of truth that resonates for them, and they turn that into the truth, even though once you say that it's the truth, you've departed from the source of truth. Truth is very brilliant. Truth is like a facet of a magnificent diamond, and it draws a person. It's so brilliant, it's so wonderful that a person feels attracted to it and wants to align with it. The problem is they're aligning with one facet of a magnificent diamond. If they would just pull the drape off of the whole diamond, they would see that the truth that they are zeroing in on and owning as being the only truth, that truth, in fact, is just one facet of a much, much larger, much more complex truth. And because it's so brilliant, because the one facet that they're looking at is so magnificent, they fail to pull the drape back and to look at the rest of the diamond because they think that they found the truth with a capital T. So again, any truth that resonates for people is a truth. And we should look for where that truth appears or exists in the big diamond, in the truth. Of course, if it doesn't really resonate for people, then we don't have to spend too much time worrying about it, because then it's just somebody trying to make something up, and it doesn't, you know, that's why I don't think that there is a lot of reason to worry about people's pronouns, because it does not resonate as truth for the vast majority of people who hear about it. So what we want to clarify about the intellectual independence in ideas is that each person is meant to develop their internal truths and to, of course, try as best as they can to take those truths and bring them down to the level of their feelings. The v'yadato hayom v'hashivosa el levavecha, supposed to know the truth and then drill it down so that it starts affecting our reactions. So we get sad about the things that we're meant to get sad about, and we get happy about the things that we're meant to rejoice over. It's part of a person's growth and training is to go from what they know to what they feel. So here is a picture of what Jewish thinking is about and why it is that the issue, for example, of the Holocaust is so fraught with error, because everybody agrees that the destruction of an entire people, or certainly a vast percentage of a people, everybody can sign on that that is terrible. But not everybody can then say, okay, so where does that fit into the larger picture of a plan that is far more complex than we have access to, of of the ruler of Hashem running the world in a way that should inspire us to a great deal of humility and modesty with regard to complaining or turning to him. The pasuk in Koheles is the classic example of that. To read that pasuk again, I don't want to read it by heart. The pasuk says, "Al tivahel al picha, v'libcha al yimaher lahotzi davar lifnehu Elokim." The pasuk in Koheles, Perek Hey, the first pasuk says, "Ki hu Elokim b'shamayim, v'yato al haaretz, al kein yiyu divarecha me'atim." Cool your guns, because Hashem knows the whole picture. He's b'shamayim, and you were down here, and you know a part of the picture. Al kein yiyu divarecha me'atim. Keep your words brief, few in number, and don't jump to start speaking tough language about Hashem. That isn't going to advance the cause of your truth. It might feel very independent to be independent of Hashem, but it's your source of truth, and it's your source of error. It's where you're going to find out what it is that is absolutely true that you can hold on to like a rock, and it's where you'll find out the things that you think or the things that people think in general are not true, and therefore they need to be put into their context and possibly even discarded.